So welcome everyone. My name is Geoff Rabideau. I'm the principal lawyer here at Rabideau Law. It's good to have you. So today we're going to be talking about fraud and fraud prevention. Now, the idea is it's not strictly related to COVID, but it's more or less related to not when we don't have the ability to meet people face to face. So it could be expanded beyond COVID, but more or less COVID brought it to light. Okay. Hopefully you all know me. My name is Geoff Rabideau. I'm the principal lawyer here at Rabideau Law. I've been a lawyer now, practicing lawyer for 13 years, and of that 12 years, I've had my own law firm. During that 12 years, I've completed over 10,000 real estate transactions, both paper and electronic, so registry and land titles. I've pretty much seen every type of transaction you can imagine. However, I'm open to seeing other complex transactions. I don't charge additional for my time to figure it out. If there's a transaction that you've seen that's quite difficult, I'd love to see it. I'm always hoping to learn and gain that more experience. Okay. Now, in terms of volume, I'm within the 10% of all real estate lawyers in Canada. Right across the province, I'm in the top. Right across the country, I'm in the top 10%. And we have an amazing 4.8 Google rating with 196 reviews. I checked that yesterday. Could be higher today. But as of this moment, 4.8 with 196 reviews. At Rabideau Law here, we pioneered the custom closing remote signing process. So we started doing remote signings about 4 years ago. And what that was is where we were going to our clients' homes, businesses, their work. Some were truck drivers. We met them in their cab as they're driving by. Even met clients in jail. And the goal behind that was we were trying to create convenience for our clients by meeting them remotely. I myself would attend on a video conferencing software such as this, a platform, and a commissioner. So Bill is one of my commissioners. He would attend and meet the clients. We have commissioners right across the province. So luckily Bill didn't have to drive everywhere, but we have commissioners right across the province, and we've been doing this remote signing for about 4 years now. Now, with the event of COVID, we then pioneered the virtual signing process. So since we had already had all the technology, we were all ready for it. One day, the very next day, we pretty much were working from home, up and running again. And we had done our signings virtually with all of our clients, therefore taking out the step of having a commissioner attend. But now we just did it virtually with video conferencing software and meeting our clients directly in their homes on their video conferencing phones, iPads, or whatever else they had. Now I have opened the chat function. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to type a question on the chat function if you have any questions. Alternatively, I'm open for discussion. If you want to unmute yourself and ask away, please go ahead. Now, I do have to disclaim, this is a presentation for educational purposes. You cannot use anything I say here for legal advice, okay? I'm a lawyer, CYA, so no legal advice given today. Now, in this instance, we're going to be talking about fraud, cases that I've seen, cases that I've researched. Now, if any of you have stories, we'd love to hear what the fraud stories that you've come across or what you've heard. So please enter them into the chat function and we'll talk about them as we go. So the purpose today is to give you a primer on fraud in Canada, talk about and help you identify the red flags of fraud. We'll talk about fraud stories, and then we'll talk about precautions to be taken when you can't meet your clients face to face. So starting off, let's talk about the types of fraud. So there's really two types of fraud. One is fraud for property, and the other one's fraud for profit. So fraud for property is where a borrower will misstate information, conceal information, misrepresent their information, or alter documents in order to qualify for a mortgage. The borrower in this instance has all intention of living in the property and paying the mortgage. However, these types of frauds come to light when the borrower has that inability to pay the mortgage. And that's at that time when either a power of sale process comes through or the lender starts reevaluating the actual documentation to make sure that they actually could have qualified at that time. The more prevalent, that's the more prevalent style, fraud for property. But the scarier is fraud for profit. Now, fraud for profit, where there's an elaborate scheme has been devised, and it typically will involve a vast number of players. It can involve a mortgage broker, realtors, even lawyers, appraisers, these are where schemes have been devised amongst groups. And what happens is these involve and sometimes they'll involve the homeowner even, or an identity theft will be involved. Now, these are the most costly types of frauds. And these fraudsters are very savvy, and they have they are capable of affecting a large number of frauds at a time, or they're capable of having frauds in a very large area and over time. Okay. So let's talk about fraud for property. Now, obviously, this is, many of you, I guess, would know these or have heard of this. So this is where people would misstate their work position, their income, or their length of time at that job. This is where they're misstating whether or not they're full-time or employees or part-time. They would misrepresent the amount of and their source of the down payment. They claim a property is going to be a rental property when it's going to be it's going to be an owner-occupied property when it's a rental property. They're not disclosing any of their debts or mortgages. They're omitting information on the values of their property. Their names on the application don't match, and they don't plan on taking the responsibility for the mortgage. So they could be using what's called a straw buyer, where they put someone on the title, and then they're going to purchase behind them. So they're using someone else to purchase the property, even though someone else is going to live in the property. Now, these are all frauds for property, all kinds of frauds for property. Now, what we see is that more than 10% of all mortgage applications involve some type of fraud. That's a high number. If you imagine, at least 1 in 10 involves some misstatement of information, people lying on their applications. Now, Equifax has indicated that mortgage frauds have increased by 52%, 52% that is, since 2013. Now, this is where it gets difficult, because the industry has been unable to substantiate these statistics. How could they? They can't discover every single fraud. So this is only the frauds that they projections and the frauds that they know about. Now, I've talked to my FCT is First Canadian Title, and I have a representative there. So I've talked to my representative at First Canadian Title. Now, FCT say they complete over 1 million title insurance policies a year, and they deny about $100 million of title insurance policies a year. Now, when I talked to them about numbers, that they said they couldn't give me a numbers. They said out of 1 million policies, they didn't know the number of policies. They just knew the dollar value of policies. So I guess when I do find out that, I'll update this presentation. But from that perspective, $100 million of policies are denied each year due to fraud. That doesn't also include the ones that actually survive and continue on. These are just the ones that they discover during the qualifying process, right? This is the ones that they discovered at the beginning. It doesn't include the ones that they deny to pay out on. Now, on average, fraud for profit costs in excess of $300,000 each one. That's about the average. So this is where the title insurance is stepping in and paying out this $300,000. And about more than 30% of the victims are seniors. And most frauds typically occur in urban areas. That's well known. Now, what's the mindset here? And this is the interesting thing. Now we're talking about fraud for property. And we've discovered that millennials would break the law to buy a house. A quarter of them, 25% of millennials, feel that it is okay to lie on their information to get a house. Now, that's interesting, because we saw it was about 10% was the national average. But if you imagine, the millennials are up to 25% saying they would lie on their documents to get a house. So it's about 23.4% of the Canadians between the age of 18 and 34 agree that it was okay to lie on their applications. The national average, agreeing that statement, was about 12%, of which 17% were men, 7% were women. So you got quite a dichotomy there. And fraudulent claims, as I mentioned, are higher in urban areas than rural areas and suburban areas. So 15% in urban, 11% in suburban, 7% in rural. Now, who's claiming fraud? Well, what we see that the largest segment claiming fraud are individuals in sales, self-employed, contract, seasonal workers. And that makes sense if you think about it. Sales, those people are predominantly on their own, commissioned or so. They can tweak their numbers, right? If they're sole proprietor sales, then they can tweak the numbers they could claim less of their expenses. So if they want to inflate their income, they would just claim less expenses, right? So it creates a greater proportion of income for them. Sales and self-employed, right? Contract, seasonal workers could be lying about their employment, saying that they're actually a full-time worker. Same with contract. Actually, let's go back. And looking at the graph, you'll see that it talks here about the gap between mortgage size and benchmark home price. So it talks about the amount of fraud happening, right? So the greater that gap, the greater the potential for fraud. And so you see, 2016, Vancouver, the gap is dramatic, right? So there's higher potential for fraud in Vancouver, of course. Now, the effects of fraud on real estate market. So obviously, let's talk about the negative effects, because I think there are only negative effects. We see escalation of property prices. So for instance, if more people are willing to lie in order to get a mortgage, the reason why is because I believe the number one reason why is because they can't qualify for the mortgage. So therefore, they're going to lie to get that mortgage. And the reason why is because the property prices are higher, which if you imagine, it's a vicious cycle. They're lying to get a property that costs more, but then that creates a cycle because more people have to lie, or more people are lying to get these higher value properties, to get higher value mortgages, right? We could talk about this then results in a housing affordability crisis. Obviously, more expensive houses, less affordability. Now, Toronto has been viewed across the world to have the third worst risk for housing bubble. What does that say about Vancouver then, right? That's really my mindset. If Toronto's the third, is Vancouver second? Is it first? And this is across the world. Obviously, these result in higher debt levels. People borrowing more, higher debt, higher property values, impact assessments, higher taxes on these properties then. People are paying higher taxes. Now, that's the negative side. The positive side then in that case is I guess the government gets more money for its coffers, but we're looking at the negative aspects of that. The mortgage stress test. So obviously every year, what we and all my mortgage professionals would talk their ears off of this about the mortgage stress test. Every year it's getting more stringent, harder and harder, because they're trying to stop the bubble. They're trying to protect the market. But by doing the mortgage stress test, it results in more people misstating their information because they're trying to beat the stress test and fill within. So once again, this vicious cycle we're seeing here, okay? And of course, as house prices go up, lack of affordable rental housing. So who are the victims of fraud? Okay, so the fact is, and this is why a lot of people will feel that fraud is a victimless crime. Fraud for property is perpetrated against the mortgage lenders, right? And fraud for profit is mostly perpetrated against the title insurance companies. Now, it's not to say that there is, mortgage fraud doesn't affect us all, but the fact is, it's mostly against those two, the lender and the title insurance provider. There are salient issues. Higher prices affects us all. Stress tests, right? One way or another, we're all paying for it. But the direct ones that are paying for it are obviously those two. So what we see is that mortgage fraud goes largely unreported. Largely because the people don't even know what's happening. The lenders or the title insurance are not knowledgeable about that actual fraud. They're reporting the frauds they do know, but the ones they don't know, obviously they can't report on. There's no national fraud registry or centralized database. So there's no database across Canada that says this was a fraud, right? Lenders are also hesitant to actually disclose that they are victims of fraud. Obviously, this would be public knowledge, would be bad business, and it would affect their image, and it would also affect their shares, right? If a large lender came out, let's say RBC came out and said that they were a major victim of crime and fraud, what do you think is going to happen to their market share? What do you think is going to happen to their shareholders, right? It doesn't do well for them. So I hate to say it, but it's a large part has become a cost of doing business, right? And that's where they just inflate that cost. Here's our fraud cost. We just inflate our cost to take in consideration what we imagine we're losing due to fraud. And also, there's a lack of resources to combat fraud. There's only specialized investigation units in Vancouver and Toronto, but not nationally. So there are steps that are being taken. And what we see is that the banks and lenders are investing in technology, and especially during this time, a large investment in technology, because they want to have advanced algorithms. They want to have fraud monitoring teams, and they want these systems there to detect fraud automatically and bring them to the light. What they're also doing is they're sharing information. So the lenders are sharing information on known fraudsters and scams, as are the mortgage insurers and the title insurers. They're also sharing information. So if, let's say, for instance, FCT comes across an attempted fraud scam, they will actually reach out to the other title insurance and say, hey, this is the people, don't give them title insurance, it's a scam, right? They will actually do that. Now, obviously, CMHC and the mortgage insurers, Genworth, offer further review on claims and any, obviously, instances where someone's applying for a mortgage that is questionable. So let's talk about the red flags of fraud. These are the things, these are the indicators that you need to look out for. And these are the top ones. If there's a private agreement of purchase and sale, well, if there's a realtor involved, the potential for fraud is dramatically less, right? And for my realtors on the call here, if there's a realtor involved, the potential to get a mortgage for your purchasers is dramatically better. So as a sales opportunity, if let's say, if you're approaching a FSBO, right? If you're approaching a FSBO, you can actually point this out to them. Say, the person that's going to buy your property will have a better time, an easier time getting a mortgage if you go through a realtor than if you for sale by owner. Because a private agreement automatically is a red flag. Automatically, it is in the system. It automatically pops up as a red flag. Okay, just so you guys know that. So this is to help you sell to your FSBOs and or anybody who says that they think they can do it on their own. No, your value is beyond this. But from that perspective, that's one argument that you have, right? Is that you help them. Your value is you help them get a mortgage. Okay, you create for them that illusion. You create that for them that reliability. Next, what we see is also fraud involves a lot of times, if there's a high ratio mortgage, then that's typically another red flag for fraud. Gifts of equity. So what happens often is a parent will say, hey, or a borrower, let's say they're buying a property, they can't qualify or they don't have the down payment, then their parent or so will say that they're going to give them the down payment as a gift, which we would call a gift of equity. They'll draft up a letter of equity saying this is a gift, but then they turn around and then they want repayment back in some form. Now that's a fraud. It is. Other instances of fraud are powers of attorney. So power of attorney is one of the biggest ones because this is instances where spouses have been abused, elderly people have been abused, family members have been abused by the use of the power of attorney. So this automatically indicates right away, pops up as a red flag. Now these pop up to CMHC, the mortgage lenders, and the title insurance. Each of these automatically goes through a review process. If there's been any recent activity on title, so one thing that the insurers are always looking at is whether or not there's been a transfer title within the last 6 months. Okay, so typically a transfer of title within the last 6 months means that it's not always, but it automatically pops up as a reviewable red flag of fraud. And investment properties always pop up as reviewable red flags of fraud. Other things that they're looking for, the insurers, now I'm talking about insurers, the lenders and the insurers are looking for with fraud, is it a rush closing? And is it a new client, whether individual or corporate? Rush closings are always considered to be potential frauds because it seems like someone's in a hurry trying to get the deal closed quickly without being caught. If there's a request to send funds to unrelated parties. So as a lawyer, when I apply for title insurance, I have to click off certain check marks, right? And one of the check marks is, am I paying the funds to anybody else besides the other lawyer on a purchase, or the borrowers on a refinance, or the seller on a sale? Well, so we don't do insurance on sales. So it's those two, borrowers or the other lawyer. If I say yes, I then have to disclose who that money is going to, right? And at that point, the insurance company looks, is this an unrelated third party? Like, so for instance, if I click yes, and then I disclose, oh, TD Visa, and I put the Visa number, they won't flag it. But if I say yes, Uncle Sam, or Uncle Smith or something like that, then that's gonna get flagged. If there's any changes to the payment instructions just before closing, so a lot of times, let's say it's set up to be a void check, and then the borrower will provide a new void check right before closing, that's another red flag of fraud, because it could be, where's that money going to be going? Whose account are they going to pay from? Because there's something I'm going to talk about soon is called synthesized identities, and that's where someone's identity has been stolen. Okay. If there's transactions on mortgage-free properties or vacant land, now this is the #1 red flag for fraud. So if a property is mortgage-free, these are the properties that fraudsters want, because in that instance, on the sale of the property, all the money goes directly to them. There's no payouts except for a realtor, if there's a realtor involved, or a lawyer, right? There's no money having to go to pay off a mortgage. So the amount, the profitability of that transaction is a lot more. If there's transactions involving elderly or vulnerable people, or people out of the country. Now, this is a really important one lately, is people out of the country, right? We've seen a lot of this because during COVID, we had a lot of our clients stuck overseas and they couldn't get back. And I had a lot of calls. I had a lot of calls of people trying to figure out how we can complete transactions while they were overseas. Also, transactions involving people who may be under the influence, under pressure, under duress, right? And mostly those are typically by family members. So let's talk about some fraud stories. This is always the juicy stuff everybody wants to hear about. So one example I can tell you is Turbo Logistics. So what we see is the appellants were found liable at trial for damages in excess of $10 million for fraudulent misrepresentation and negligent misrepresentation, conversion, and conspiracy in connection with loans made to the company by the respondent bank. So HSBC had sued Turbo Logistics, right? And Turbo Logistics sued them back, right? Saying, obviously for damages, but found out that Turbo Logistics was found liable and owed HSBC in excess of $10 million. And this was due to misrepresentations on their documents, right? Submitted false information. What we see also is there was a mortgage broker's case. So a mortgage broker case in BC. So the broker in BC was accused of using fake financial information and documents to dupe lenders into giving out over $500 million of loans, right? This example is stunning because this broker had an entire network of licensed professionals, banking staff that were all working together. So he had a representative at each, typically a lot of the lenders, the underwriters at these lenders, the ones that should be working on behalf of the lender, they were working on his behalf to get these deals through, right? And hundreds of customers he had hundreds of customers who were willingly turning a blind eye to these fake documents and frauds because they wanted these properties. So this is a huge example of fraud for property. What we also saw is in BMO. So BMO noticed a lot of irregularities in some mortgages in Alberta. So there was a massive fraud scheme there in Alberta, which involved hundreds of people, ranging from applicants to the mortgage brokers, to the bank employees, to lawyers, and even one Calgary MP. That's a member of parliament was involved in these schemes, right? BMO advanced about $70 million in mortgage funds, and it estimated losses were about $30 million. So the fact, now this is what's surprising. BMO in this case decided to sue, which is an oddity, because once again, most lenders will bury this under the rug, try and recoup what they can, but keep it quiet because they don't want their shareholders and the world to know about this. Where BMO in this case went national with this case because they had gone through the courts. What we also see, one of the questions here, good question, says, why do you think that high ratio mortgages could be fraud? So one of the reasons why high ratio mortgages have a higher probability of fraud is because less skin in the game. The fraudsters don't have to put down money then to cause the fraud to be completed. So if they're only putting down 5% to get back 500,000 versus putting down 100,000 to get back 500,000, right? So from that perspective, fraudsters want to put the least amount of their own money down in order to get the largest gain from it. So we had a case that came to us here at Rabideau Law, And so I'm going to show you this one. This was an interesting one. And this is what actually was the litmus for this presentation. So the fraudsters came to us from an unknown referral source, brand new referral source we had never worked with before. We saw changes right away in the information. The letters were the letters were wrong. The symbols appear to be different. The referral source came from an interactive brokers, which with two eyes, because there's actually a company out there called Interactive Brokers, but this was Interactive Brokers with two eyes versus the legitimate broker, Interactive Brokers. The purchaser was listed as Suez Treatment Solutions Canada LP, but it was from New Jersey. And there is a Suez Treatment Solutions Canada LP located in Lancaster. But the one that they used was Suez Treatment Solutions Inc., right? So just the differences, the small LP versus Inc., they try to slide by us. And at further glance, the documents appear to be sloppy, right? And contradictory or questionable. The closing date, when the deal first came to us, the closing date had already passed, and the fraudster was more than willing to change the date without even consulting the other party, like, oh, we'll just change the date, right? So they were not well advised. It wasn't a very difficult scheme for us to spot, and they really didn't know how the industry worked, as you can tell. They were pretty sloppy. And then you'll see on the next slide, they sent us a check for the closing funds, right? And now the check was in US funds. It wasn't in Canadian funds. And the fraudsters wanted us to start working, and out of nowhere, a check appeared at our office, right? So here's a copy of the check. So you'll see it's really sloppy. So you see the company, it says, you know, Suez Canada LP, when the actual company was Inc. The address was New Jersey. It talked about here, it says payable through the Bank of Nova Scotia, but it was in New York. The check there says US funds. And at the bottom here, it talked about some of these numbers. And so just from that perspective, you could see right away just how sloppy this was. So it wasn't hard for us to spot, right? What we did actually is we took this check. I like to have a little fun with it. When this happens, I'm like, hey, first you got to pay our legal fees in advance. Pay us online with Visa. They never paid. They just said, take your money from them check. So then when I next did is I took this check to the Waterloo Region Police, gave it to the officer, and then I went back to these guys, said, hey guys, we've given you a check to the police. Here's his card. Go pick up your check if you want it. They never went to pick up the check, of course. Now, what we've in large part talked about, now that was a fraud for profit, but a large part of what we talked about is fraud for property. Now, the hardest ones to spot, and these are the ones that are escalating more, and the ones that are costing more, are identity theft, right? So obviously a client uses a fake ID to assume the identity of an existing property owner. And so I've heard of this scam. Client will then sell the property, and if there's a mortgage on it, they discharge that mortgage. But once again, this is why they want properties that don't have a mortgage on it, because they don't want to discharge thing. They want the most value possible. They then, it's the new purchaser will get a mortgage. So you typically have a fraudulent seller and a fraudulent purchaser. The fraudulent purchaser has a fake ID. The fraudulent seller has the fake ID of a true homeowner. The fraudulent purchaser will get a mortgage. They then dupe lawyers into, dupe lawyers. They buy the property with this new high ratio, typically mortgage. The money then is paid to the fraudulent seller, and then the fraudsters run away and get the money together. Now, sometimes if they have a lot of schemes going on, they'll make a few payments on this mortgage just so the other schemes happen. Sometimes if they don't have a lot of schemes going on, they'll just won't make any payments. And in that instance, what happens then is the lender will then start notice of sale, default proceedings against the current homeowner. The current homeowner will get a notice of sale indicating that, hey, you're not paying your mortgage, we're coming after you. The homeowner is quite questionable at that time, like, hey, I don't have a mortgage at RBC or Equitable Bank or whoever this is. And then at that point, provided they have title insurance, they can approach their title insurance, and the title insurance will pay and cover the cost to get the title put it back in their name and pay out the mortgage lender. Now, if they don't have title insurance, then at that point, this is where it gets difficult. A homeowner who has no mortgage with no title insurance loses their home to that new mortgage lender, RBC or Equitable Bank. This is true because it's RBC and Equitable Bank that has become the victim of fraud, not the homeowner. So if in the event you know somebody or you have clients that have a home which has no title insurance on it, and it has no mortgage, my invitation is you should suggest to them that they can get a homeowner's policy of title insurance. It's only like $200-300, but at least that case, it protects their investment in the home so they never lose their home and become a victim of fraud. A lot of time, continuing on with this scenario, what you see is there's always a hurry. So typically, they're always trying to rush people. They're always in a hurry, right? And what they do is they discourage home inspection and appraisals. Now, what we're seeing is the new brand of types of fraud. Now, these are the scariest ones that you can imagine. So what's happening is that fraud is evolving in such a way that the fraudsters are becoming a lot smarter. So as the title insurance and the lenders and the insurers catch up, the fraudsters are finding new ways, right? And so what they actually are doing is they are doing what's called synthetic identity theft and fraud. They're taking someone's ID and they're altering it in such a way so that part of it is fake, but part of it is real. So this involves someone who's working inside somewhere. It could be, and this is where it gets difficult, people are putting their credit card information online, buying stuff online, and I'm fairly certain you've all heard of this, stories where someone bought something online, but the item never came to them. It was one of these Facebook advertisements or these Instagram advertisements like, hey, buy this product, and you put it in, your information in, and you never get the product. Well, what happens is in that instance, if you pay through PayPal, you're a lot better. So always pay through PayPal online, people. But if you don't, if you put your information in, make sure you're buying from a reputable source, not one of these advertisements. Because what happens is, two, you just lost your money from your credit card. And the other thing is the information you just put in, they take from you and they sell off to make synthetic identities. And what happens is synthetic identity is that information now gets taken, a new person gets created, and this new person takes control of your life. They take control of your credit report. They change your address. They change all your identifiable information. And now they can go out, get cars, apply for mortgages, anything else they want. And you can't do anything. You can't even go to the credit reporting agencies because you are not that person anymore. They've hijacked your identity, right? So this is the scary new ones we're seeing now, okay? So they use real and fake ID in order to create a new identity. And what in Canada, these new synthetic identity frauds are costing over $1 billion every year. So not all the parts of the identity are fake, as I mentioned, because typically if you give in your name, your phone number, your address, they can find out. And if you put any information, typically you don't put your SIN in, but a lot of times you don't need a credit report, you don't need a SIN number to pull a credit report, right? So typically somehow there's someone who's also involved. They could have a credit reporting agency, someone who works there, or a mortgage broker, or someone involved, and then they could pull the information from the credit report, and typically that could then might be able to provide them the SIN number. But once again, you don't need a SIN number to pull a credit report. And the fraudsters usually have access to personal information, as I mentioned. It could be a bank employee, something like that. They get access to your SIN, and they get the assigned credit information, and they can then change your credit, change the address, report to them. They can change the date of birth if they want. They can report, they can change things like that. And like I say, they'll make subtle changes which will lock you out of your own credit report. The fraudsters then apply for credit with your information, and they might make initially some small payments and maintain the credit good, maintain good credit until they can build up, enough, I guess, confidence with your identity to go for a mortgage. But eventually, as I mentioned, they will apply for a mortgage, line of credit, or anything else, and then they'll bust out or they'll max out the credit, and then they'll disappear with those funds. So here's things to look out for synthetic ID, right? Synthetic ID frauds. So, and this is from a mortgage broker's perspective. Number one, does the SIN number match, or is it not matching, or is there a bunch of different identities matched to that SIN number? Okay. Another thing is if the credit file depth is inconsistent with the age of the person. So for instance, let's say the person applying is 30 years old, but they only have two items on their credit report. It's not too far off, but it seems pretty small, pretty low. What happens if that person's 18 years old, but has 10 things on their credit report? right? Or 19-year-olds and has 10 things on the credit report. So these are the things you're looking at. How many items do they have on their credit report? If there's multiple applications with the same phone number, another red flag, things to be concerned about synthetic ID. If the mailing address is wrong, or if they've been using secured credit cards to create a good credit rating, right? So I trust you understand that. It's called piggybacking. You use secured credit card, or it's like a pyramid, piggybacking. You use one to pay the other, and you're constantly doing this to build a credit report to keep it going, to get good credit. Now, what we're seeing is the largest victims, and this is hugely important. The largest victims of synthetic ID is children, right? Because children and elderly make great targets. They're the best targets. And what we're seeing is the information for children can be bought off the internet for $300 on the dark web, right? So, and children are, as I mentioned, 51 times more likely to fall victim than adults. Why is this? Social media. Children are disclosing so much of their information on social media that the fraudsters are taking this information and selling it off on the dark web, right? So this is a good idea for parents on here. Be careful with the information that your children share, of course. So let's talk about how to prevent fraud in a virtual world. Now, when it comes to fraud for property, it's very difficult. It's all about just looking at the documents, right? And the information, the credit report, and the identifiers, if they're sloppy. And as I mentioned, I showed you that check previously. Anything such as that, the documents were sloppy, everything. That's really what you're looking for, is fraud for property, the identifiable sloppiness, okay? And or misinformation. When it comes for fraud for profit, it all comes down to the ID, right? It's all about the ID and the credit report, anything such as that. Now, from a realtor's perspective, this is a lot harder on you guys, right? Because you guys don't get their credit report. So it's more or less, it's for you guys, it's the ID, right? So when we're looking at ID, well, if you're not meeting face-to-face, how can you verify the ID is legitimate ID? So obviously, video conferencing software, you can have them pull up their ID and show you the ID, right? I often will videotape on my conferences. I'll often record the conferences, right? I'll obtain a high resolution image of the front and back of the ID prior to the meeting, and then I'll get them to show me the ID in the meeting. And what I'll do is I'll get them to turn it. So, well, I shouldn't be using a business card, but I'll get them to turn it. So then this way you see the reflection, right? So if you get the reflection, sorry, I have my background's eating the ID, but you understand what I'm saying. So I often do that with my video conferencing clients. Well, obviously when they're witnessing documents, I'll watch them sign the documents, make sure they're actually signed by their hands, right? So you can see them sign. There are other ways to do it. Now, you can check the MTO website. There's ways to verify the ID with the MTO website. You can do reverse searches with telephone number lookup. You can look at social media. You can look up Google. You can look up, brokers you guys have some great opportunities, great software out there to look people up, right? You can look up if you receive a check, right? If you're concerned about, now, realtors, this is a big one for you guys. You want to be concerned about fraudulent checks, right? Because the check so here's a scheme that a lot of them want to do. They want to give you a fraudulent check. Then what they want to do is if the transaction fails, they want you to pay them back that check. But what happens is by the time that you pay them back, because if you deposit the check, you need a certain amount of time for that check to clear before finding out it was a fake check. Then at that point, the check is paid back from the brokerage to the fraudulent fake purchaser. And now they have legitimate cash, and you find out, your brokerage finds out that the money that was paid into your account was a fake check, and now you're out that money. So once again, this is where you want to confirm the transit numbers on these checks. And then from a perspective of duress, you want to verify who else is in the room with them, right? So for when we do video conference, I ask, can you please show me the room? I want to see, is anybody else in that room on the signing appointment? Now, at Rabideau Law, we also have a technology that we use here to scan ID. Now, I'm going to show you this technology. All right. Excuse me 1 second when I zoom. Under Law Society rules, we have to take 2 pieces of non-expired ID, government ID, that is valid. We actually take this a step further, and we actually have an app in which we use to scan the ID to make sure it is valid and non-fake ID. Can everybody hear that? Here's my driver's license. Yeah. Scan it. And there, here it pulls all the information verifying that it's all correct ID. All right, so that's the app that we use to scan ID, right? Obviously, I'm not 40 anymore. That was a few years ago, but it's just for you to see, right? See how the information pulled. Now, if the information didn't pull, it didn't come up green and it didn't show, then that— Appreciate you guys meeting with me via WebEx. Sorry, what's that? Everybody there? So, sorry about that. So that's the app we use to pull the information. Obviously, if the ID didn't scan, then it's a concern for us. And at that point, we ask for further ID and we ask for further information. So once again, my name is Geoff Rabideau. I'm the principal lawyer here at Rabideau Law. Now, in the region of Waterloo region where we're from, we're called Rabideau Law. Outside the region, we've called ourselves Custom Closing. And the only reason why was because there's really no goodwill with my name outside the region. A lot of people didn't know my name. Plus, truthfully, a lot of people had a difficulty spelling my name, so we went with Custom Closing. So it's customclosing.ca, you'll see there, and rabideaulaw.ca. We are a real estate lawyer. You all know us, hopefully, and I'm here to answer any questions you may have. So
Dominique and Benny wanted to know the name of the app that you use for scanning ID, Geoff.
Yep, so the app is called Veriscan. So we'll send that to you. Can the app scan a photo? No, it cannot. It is unable to scan a photo, but it also can scan passports. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining in. Oh, how concerned as brokers do we need to be if the lawyers are checking ID at signing? So, from a broker's perspective, you need to be as concerned as we do, because it is under your FinTrack rules, know your client rules, that you also have to take all that information. Furthermore, if in the event, let's say the transaction was a fraudulent purchaser, it would look very poorly on you if your lender found out and then they trace it back to you. So yes, we're doing our due diligence to protect you as also, but it's also incumbent upon you to make sure you do your due diligence and know your client.
Where this comes up most often is if we're not actually meeting with the client. So the best thing you can do for us is to provide us with high resolution photographs. If you're getting photographs through digital or social media, that kind of thing, so that by the time they get to us, we know we've got a really good quality photograph. I always check the photograph that the clients hold up to the camera and compare it to the addresses on the documents that the client is executing with me when I sign with the client through virtual media. But again, one of the issues that we very often have with people sending us ID is that ID isn't of sufficient quality to really allow us to rely on it. So we, of course, also take ID, but where we're going through three sets of people, from the realtor, the broker, to the lawyer, to the lender, it's nice if everybody's doing their due diligence, because one of us is going to catch false ID if in fact it's been adulterated at some point during that process. But high resolution photographs are always really nice when we get them from brokers and realtors.
Yeah, and from our perspective, under the Law Society rules, we have to have a scan or a picture of the front and back of the ID. So it's required. We will be getting it too. So it's always on us that we do take care of that. But as Bill said, it's on all of us actually to fight fraud. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. So you don't have to get the back of ID, but the Law Society requires us to get the back of the ID. And the reason why is because a lot of fake ID only has the front of the ID. right? A lot of fake ID, they don't spend the time doing the back of it. So that's a way to fight to make sure that it's fake or legitimate ID is by getting a scan or a picture of the back and front of the ID. Okay. Well, I hope you all learned something from this. I guess the most important thing you take away from this is protect your ID, protect your identity, protect your children's identity, protect your family's identity. Don't let them put all that information online, because synthetic identity is the wave of the future for fraud. It's the concern, and it's scary. It really is. You could totally lose your identity and not be able to get it back, because someone would hijack it from you, and at that point, it is going to be very difficult to get your life back. Okay, guys? Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time. All the best.
Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ann.